Now comes the hard bit.
So thank you very much, Professor, for the talk. What I mostly take away from it is that we can learn more from looking at monkeys than reading Marx. That's very interesting. I know I promised to give the floor to the audience, but I can't help myself. And I had one question. Well, I have two questions. The first is how can you be sure that inequality comes first, and that it's not the case that the different problems that you're describing somehow account for the inequality that you're seeing, so that the causality might be just the opposite than the one that you're describing?
Yes, there are now quite a few studies that show the lag periods. The shorter term lags, a very good sophisticated study using American data shows that after a rise in inequality, health starts to be affected about 3 years later. It goes on, the effects go on coming through until about 12 years later, when health reaches a new level, whether it's higher or lower, depending on the changes in inequality. There have also now been papers showing the lifelong effects of inequality. And as part of that picture, we're understanding some of the epigenetic processes through which early experience changes gene expression. But you see, if you argue that the causality goes the other way, if you ignore this evidence, you have to find something else which will plausibly affect so many quite different problems and explain why they're all worse in a country like the United States and better in some of the Scandinavian countries.
Social policies, perhaps?
Successful over a whole range of things. I don't think we know how to, well, certainly health services are not the most powerful influence on health. It's very difficult to find any relationship between provision of medical care and life expectancy in a population. Medical care makes a difference to having your hips done, your knees done, your corneas, but it doesn't make you live much longer. Much more important than the treatment you get for a disease is whether you get it in the first place and what age you get it. And as I say, chronic stress looks like more rapid aging, but if it's problems like alcohol and drugs that are also powerfully related to inequality, nobody thinks that drug rehabilitation units really determine the level of these problems. People who work on criminologists talking about prisons and the police suggest that those are not the powerful influences on crime rates in different countries. Inequality seems to be the crucial influence on levels of violence in a society. There are now about 60 studies on that. So I think if you did think of anything sufficiently deeply rooted, it would have to be something related to social status because it affects only the problems related to social status. We did a formal test of that, looking at death rates that have no social gradient and others that have very steep social gradients, and sure enough, it's the ones with steep social gradients and not the others which are affected by inequality. So nobody has suggested anything else which is deeply seated in society and plausibly influence outcomes with these, what I call social gradients. But that, of course, is if you are willing to ignore the evidence of lag times and so on.
Okay, and...
Sorry to give a long answer.
No, that's not a problem. Another question I had, since Thomas Piketty, we know that there is another thing next to income inequality, and it's wealth inequality, which is often much larger than the disparities in income. Would that change the story, you think, if we take that into account? Do we have any data on that?
Well, internationally comparable data on wealth inequality is available for much fewer countries. There are more problems with it. The Luxembourg income study has recently been producing what they call, I think, the Luxembourg Wealth Study. It's one of the places where they put together the national databases so they get the individual returns from Belgium or Britain where people have stated their income in a survey or their wealth. and then they work out how to make it internationally comparable. The only papers I've seen looking at wealth in relation to population health, for the few countries where there is data, it looks very similar to what we see with income inequality. I suspect that ideally you'd have some weighted average of the two, because I think what it's about is how material differences between us create the social distances between us, those feelings of superiority and inferiority, and in a way strengthen everything to do with class and status. And every now and then even conservative politicians say they want to create a classless society. You can't do that without reducing the material differences.
Okay, so as promised, we go to the floor. I'm not sure how we're going to do this exactly. There's somebody with a microphone over there. So first is first. A gentleman over here has a question. You can choose to speak in English, Dutch, French. I can translate.
I prefer to... Can you hear me? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
No.
Yes. I won't need this.
If I've understood what you presented, you're saying that reducing income inequality and the effect it has on various things is not what you call a zero-sum game. In other words, it's not what the rich give up and the poor gain. Everybody gains in that game. Is that right?
Yes, I remember the first meeting, academic meeting, where I was talking about this stuff. I talked about taking money from the rich, raising top tax rates and so on, and people said, well, it would depend what you did with it. And I said, no, it would be beneficial even if you threw it in the sea.
Okay, that's clear. But that's also why it must be so difficult to get people to accept that that is a reality. It almost sounds like a fairy tale.
Well, I think that people are aware of consumerism and status competition and so on, realize, I remember reading a study where people had thought everyone else was consumerist, interested in status competition, but each person thought they were different. It's just you people who are nasty like that. I have different values. And when they put these people together in focus groups, they were very excited when they found, that other people feel the same as I do. And I think that the status concerns are very powerful. And as I say, much more powerful with more inequality. But I think at the same time, there are an increasing number of young people, often at home at least, kids not interested in politics at all, who just regard, I'm sorry to say this, they just regard society as shit. They don't want anything to do with it. And you use drugs and so on to get away from it. And the social anxieties produced around status concerns are so great that young people, they need a few drinks before they go out to a party or whatever. Ecstasy, when you get there, would make you feel at ease with everyone else. The uses of those drugs are often to deal with the social anxieties. I left that bit out rather of my talk, but they're extraordinarily powerful. No, I shouldn't do it. I'll forget it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, another question? There's a lady over there.
Professor, good evening. I had a question. So one of the last things you mentioned is that community has given away to property.
I'm not hearing you very well.
Are you hearing me now?
My hearing is bad, but maybe Jan can...
I can't hear you very
And what
very
about
good.
now? Because
Yeah.
I can hear myself really loud. So one of the last things you mentioned is that community has given away to property.
What? Can you repeat?
Well, one of the last things that you mentioned was that we need to rebuild community instead of chasing property. That's
well, no, that right now there are people more concerned with property than with community.
Yeah.
Now, if I read Marx correctly, Marx said that there was a dialectic relationship between property and human nature. Now, if we assume that is true, do you think it's possible to create an equal society in today's society that is based on property rights?
So the question is, can we, given the society that we live in, where property is very important and tends to push community building aside, that we can reverse that process?
We can reverse the process. Yeah. Well, I think that there's been an enormous rise in concern with inequality over the last, 5 or 10 years. I put up statements by world leaders. Of course, people at the bottom, the poor, are most affected. The effects are biggest at the bottom of society. It is there that we need to start, whether with better social security systems or more progressive tax on the top. But am I getting this?
I think so. Let's ask the question.
I thought you were talking about community as well.
Well, I'm talking about how community is replaced by property, because there's a dialectic relationship. If you worship property, you want more and more of it, and there's less time and space for community. So my question was really, is it possible to create an equal society where the Constitution defends property? It's one of the principles.
Okay. So given the fact that in law you have...
Take my thing away. So.
In law that you have property agreements that are into civil law is built on the fact that property is protected. Doesn't that limit the ability to create a community?
Well, look, since in the 1960s and 70s, top tax rates, even in nasty countries like the United States and Britain, were 80 or 90%. We live in a democracy. I know that the power of money has been quite damaging to democracy in many countries, but if the 99% can't outvote the 1%, then there isn't any hope. But I think that, and what we are seeing is a huge change in public opinion. Since around the end of the 1970s, the political pendulum has been swinging to the right, with the neoliberal thinking coming in and privatization and these income differences opening up and reduction of top tax rates and so on. But there has been there's been very clear evidence that that movement has stopped and the pendulum has started to swing back again. And I think there are long swings, there are international swings in ideology. I think what the world leaders are saying is powerfully indicative. The OECD has already got agreement from the tax havens, most of the big tax havens, to share data with tax authorities in different countries. That is an essential preliminary to putting up top tax rates. It's done not only because governments are worried about the loss of taxes from the rich and big companies, it's also because they want to see what's happening to money, whether it's going into funding terrorism and stuff. But there are so many indications. In Britain we've had an extraordinary change in our Labour leadership to a much more radical position. In the United States, Bernie Sanders, despite calling himself a socialist, is getting substantial support. Piketty's book sold so well, although it's a difficult book and long book to read. These are all signs of a real groundswell of concern with inequality. There are people like Chris Hedges in the States who say that all avenues of reform have been blocked off. The press is controlled by the rich. The political system is controlled by the rich. Big corporations manipulate governments and society. But I think even with that perspective, there are signs, as I said, of changing public opinion. And that is there are always possibilities that come up completely unforeseen. And many of the great sort of uprisings that have been in different historical periods are as unpredicted as the financial collapse in 2007-8. I don't think we're locked in.
Maybe let me follow up on that with another question, because of course also this talk happens, it's overshadowed by the events in Paris, by the fact that terror is back in our streets also in Europe. Aren't you afraid that the whole agenda of the war on terror will push inequality to the back of the agenda once again, maybe for a long time to come?
I think that is a danger. But I think that greater equality is an important way of reducing recruitment to some of those organizations, just as the school shootings predominantly in the United States, but they've happened in some European countries too. Those are people who feel humiliated and powerless. They're kids who've had a pretty tough time from other kids, and the shootings have often taken the form of, I'll show you what I can do. People really showing they can make a difference, and that's exactly what the relationships between inequality and violence are about. I think on the terrorism front, the same things that feed into some forms of violence within our societies also help recruit to terrorism. People feeling powerless, purposeless. But of course there's also climate change. And if we're going to deal with problems of refugees, we know the only long-term solution is economic development in developing countries. We must put much more into that. We know that if we're going to solve the problems of carbon emissions and get really strong agreements, I don't think what's going to happen in Paris just coming up, those commitments are not enough, and there's no enforcement, there's not much reason to think that the countries will keep to the pledges they've made, and even those pledges are, if they did keep to them, they would only keep global warming to just under 3 degrees. So I suspect we're into more like 4 degrees. But we need greater equality both to deal with carbon emissions, to get these agreements, and to reduce recruitment to terrorist organizations.
Okay, another question? Oh, there's a lot of hands all of a sudden. But I think the gentleman here in the front was the first one to raise his hand. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Wilkinson, for your lecture. The question is, let's take two brothers. And one has a lot of self-confidence and the other not. And we can suppose that after some years, one will succeed in his life and the other one could stay poor or become poor because he have no self-confidence. So
you're going to be able to help me.
What?
The boom of the microphone, I find, really messes up my hearing aids. But carry on, and he'll tell me if I miss some.
The question is, who is more important, the fact that having self-confidence or to being poor or rich in the beginning?
Which is more important, to have self-confidence or?
Starting point, poor or rich, or be confident or have less confidence to make it in life?
Well, the studies of health and happiness both show the importance of good social relations, involvement in community life, the quality of your relationship with your partner. we don't want relationships that are about superiority and inferiority. That's what does the damage. In experiments where they make little wounds on people's arms, little puncture wounds, and they measure how quickly it heals. If you have a bad relationship with your partner, it heals more slowly. All the negative things, the damage that come from bad social relationships. So it's not a choice of one or the other. We want to move to a social environment which doesn't make these issues so powerful, which doesn't leave us with that stark choice and people at the bottom feeling they're demeaned and worthless, to the point where, you know, those who resist often turn to violence as the only way they can show, you know, that you have to respect me. Am I answering your question? No. He says no. Let's have another go. I'm sorry.
Maybe we can have someone from the back, because there was a lot of hands there as well. Yes.
I'm just hearing boom,
yeah,
boom,
lady
boom,
there in the
boom.
back.
I'm sorry if I missed what you were saying.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I wanted just to ask you to kindly comment on the differences in reduction or increase of inequality due to, from one side, a global economic growth due to prosperity in general, and from the other side, reducing growth or reducing economic wealth due to natural disasters or war or different other circumstances. So we could have basically the poorer getting richer, but we could also potentially, hypothetically, have also the richer getting poorer due to some unforeseen circumstances. Thank you.
Talking about global issues,
Well,
reducing
I didn't
inequality,
really
or-
also get the question, but I think that the basic dilemma here is whether you think if inequality is going to decline, whether it is because of the richer people getting less rich or the poorer people getting richer.
I do think that the changes in inequality are driven primarily by politics. And that's something that Paul Krugman argues in his book, The Conscience of a Liberal. He talks about that U-shaped change in inequality in the 20th century and produces quite good evidence that it's driven by politics. But when he wrote that book, he didn't know about the inverse relationship with trade union strength. And I suspect it's not simply the strength of the labor movement or of social democratic parties, but probably was also the fear of communism. Roosevelt in the 1930s apparently said that they must reform to preserve. They felt the system was under threat. And I think that the Great Depression in the 1930s was probably seen by many people as the collapse of capitalism that Marxism had always predicted. And I think there was enormous fear of that. Another example where you're seeing the same sort of forces working, there's a World Bank report on the East Asian countries, which we used to call the Asian tigers in the 1990s. And they said in each case, those rapidly growing economies had reduced their inequality between about 1960 and 1980. They have a chapter on why they reduced their inequality. They said in each case there were problems of legitimacy for the government. They faced communist rivals. So South Korea faced North Korea. In Taiwan, they faced the claims of mainland China. In the Philippines, there were guerrilla forces operating. They go through these examples and show that the governments went in for policies that they called shared growth to gain popular support because of the dangers of communism. I think those kind of things tell us the sort of scale of social movements and maybe fear that the establishment has to have to make major differences. We need to build strong social movements. Already there are signs that the bankers and people are not always taking the maximum bonuses they can. There's been some sign of a diminution in those bonuses. And one or two people at the top who've made a real merit of it and rather advertised the fact that they're not taking their bonuses. And I think we need to make those people feel that instead of being respected, they will be seen as greedy and selfish and antisocial. I think that's probably the fear that led to the rapid decline of inequality from the 30s right through until the late 70s.
What is the first thing you would advise to any governments on how to tackle inequality? What is the first measure they should take?
Well, I think the action against tax havens is really crucial. I think all forms of tax avoidance have to be dealt with. I think that that is preliminary to making taxes more progressive again. You can't increase top tax rates by very much at the moment because rich people can hide their money away. You have to deal with those problems first. But, the danger of doing it just through redistribution, taxes and benefits, is that a new government can undo it all so easily. It's in the workplace, in businesses, that these problems are really created. In the public sector, I don't know about Belgium, but in many countries, the public sector pay differences are 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, something like that. But in a paper on the 350 biggest companies in the United States, the differentials were 1 to 300 or 400. In Britain, the Financial Times share index, the biggest 100 companies going into that, the ratio on average is 1 to 300. So this problem is concentrated in the private sector, and we know that those companies run rings around national governments and often behave in extraordinarily antisocial ways, whether it's pharmaceutical companies or food processing companies or what we've had from Volkswagen recently, which has killed thousands of people. I don't know whether some of you may know of a book that came out recently called Lethal but Legal. And it's written about the main damage to public health in the United States. And it says it's the alcohol companies, the gun lobby, car manufacturers, and food processing. Those major sectors of the economy. Of course, we need these companies to produce what we need, but endlessly they face that conflict between profit and public interest. Whenever there's a new bit of academic research that casts doubt on some food additive, or the health of some practice, or insecticides, or what's been happening with carbon emissions, the first people who come and challenge it and say that research is completely wrong and are first put up on the radio or television to challenge it are people defending the profits of that business. We must deal with the antisocial behavior of those companies, and I think it's part of the process of democratizing them. The signs are that more democratic companies behave better.
Okay. Perhaps one final question, the lady here in the front. No. I'm sorry. The lady behind you.
Hi. So based on the answer you just gave about Asian economies' commitment to shared growth because of the threat they experience from possible communist uprisings in their countries, and the comment you gave before about because of the threats of terrorism in Western Europe right now, income inequality might become or be pushed back in the agenda. I understand, as I understood your lecture and the answer you gave, I would think exactly the opposite, that income inequality, among other types of inequality, would become the most or the highest priority, because as I understood, it's mostly social status difference associated with income inequality that causes these social problems. So if social status difference not only arises from income inequality, but also from other types of inequality, like, I don't know, maybe racism, or
maybe what?
Racism, or misogynism, or, I don't know, Islamophobia, things like that. If you have groups in particular countries that feel they are deprived or despised even, have been so for years, and that this is mostly what causes their feeling of inferiority, I think this should push equality in general and income inequality among different types of inequality to the top of the agenda in Western Europe and maybe even the United States, where you have these movements like Black Lives Matter and stuff, problematizing the inequalities, the different types of inequalities. So I just wanted you maybe to comment on that, and if you agree or disagree, just to share your thoughts on it. Thank you.
I'm sure I understood at least 2/3 of your question. I think that the problems of racism and inequality are intertwined. I think that as soon as any group, there's an endless tendency. You see it in New Zealand, the prejudice against the Maoris, or in the United States against American Indian populations, the Aborigines in Australia. Being marginalized in all those situations produces very much the same responses. And of course the host community, well, I shouldn't say the host community, because of course those groups were there first, but the white populations in those countries see these characteristics, the drinking and violence, as almost genetically part of that ethnic minority. And yet you see exactly the same way in which cultures fall to bits in different societies. In the United States, we were challenged by people who said it's not inequality, it's the proportion black, as if that is what creates the poorer performance in so many ways. But of course the two things are intertwined, because, you know, it's not skin color that creates the worst performance in so many different outcomes. It's not linguistic group, where that is the marker of status, or religious affiliation, where in other societies that is the marker of status. It's when any of those things become markers of status that they attract the same kind of discrimination. I think that, so the prejudices are made worse by bigger income differences. There is a strong tendency to look up to and admire the people above you, and to look down on you and say, at least I'm better than those people, to regain a sense of your position. But I think there are also quite independent forces operating in racism, to do with partly how long a country has had to acclimatize and get used to and get to know people from other countries. In Britain, I think that some of the worst signs of racism have diminished. I remember in the 1960s, 1950s, people advertising a room to let in their houses would often say, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. That standard little thing to see on a little card advertising a room. And that kind of racism, I think, has gone. it's no longer acceptable anywhere, and young people particularly. But I think that the danger that immigration can have is that people don't want the sort of redistributive social policies to help another group that they feel are undeserving. That's the danger.
The leader was also alerting us to a very interesting paradox, I think, that given that the terror threat, inequality may move back on the agenda, whereas it should perhaps be at the front of the agenda if we want to deal with this terrorism, if we want to solve it.
Oh, it's going, I see you move down like that. I thought, yeah. I do think that's an enormous danger. I do suspect that there will be increasing conflict, not only from things like ISIS, but from refugees from climate change, which is going to affect poorer countries. 90% of the suffering is predicted to be there. Estimates already suggest that 300,000 a year may be dying from climate change. There are going to be huge swathes of refugees from climate change and from conflict caused by climate change over water supplies and so on. I think there's a very real possibility that our politics will become dominated by issues to do with war, climate change, and refugees. Other things will get swept away. I think we have to fight very hard for these issues to move them up the agenda. I think it's a very crucial time from that point of view, but actually climate change, increasingly people do see climate change as necessitating greater equality, partly because the biggest threat to any policies to reduce emissions, carbon emissions, is consumerism. That's why we'll all oppose carbon taxes or whatever. Yet, as I've shown, well, I'm not sure that I did show you slides about how consumerism is intensified by greater inequality. There are studies now that show that people spend their money on conspicuous consumption, on flashy cars and so on. They do that more if they live in more unequal places. There are several American studies. You can also look at searches on Google, and people search for status goods more in the more unequal countries and the more unequal American states. Quite interesting studies with good methods where they get people to rate the things blind according to whether they think these are status goods or not. So I think from the point of view of climate change, we need much greater equality, not only within countries for those reasons, but also between countries if we're ever going to get international binding agreements on carbon emissions.
Okay, and on this note, I think we can close off the evening. I would like to thank the audience for the very interesting questions, and of course thank the organizers for making this possible, and last but not least, thank Professor Wilkinson for his inspiring talk.
Can I apologize for my inability to